Sometimes the deepest pain comes from losing what once gave us the most hope. Grace stood in her backyard under the bright noontime sun, staring at her grandmother's Virgin Mary statue, now placed on an old wooden table like an offering to her. Onanga, the porcelain figure, had been her childhood comfort, the same statue she'd whispered desperate prayers to when her world felt safe and God felt real. Now, after years of unanswered pleas and shattered faith, she gripped the blowtorch with trembling hands. She ignited the flame and directed it at the statue. But instead of crumbling under the intense heat, something impossible happened. The porcelain began to glow brighter, radiating a warmth that touched her soul in ways she hadn't felt since childhood. What happens when an atheist's act of rebellion becomes the very thing that changes a pastor's faith forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Grace Whitfield had spent 34 years learning how to live with disappointment, but the last 5 had taught her how to live without hope. She stood in her kitchen that Tuesday morning, coffee growing cold in her hands, staring at the empty space where her grandmother's Virgin Mary statue had sat for 3 years since Nana Catherine's passing. The statue now rested on her back porch table, waiting for what she'd planned to do at noon when the neighbors would be at work and no one could witness her final break from faith. Her modest 2-bedroom house in Millbrook felt smaller each day, filled with the remnants of a life that had once made sense. Religious artifacts collected dust on shelves, a wooden crucifix above the doorway, rosary beads in a ceramic bowl, prayer cards tucked between books she no longer read. At 34, Grace had the kind of quiet beauty that came from years of listening to other people's problems. As a social worker at Millbrook Family Services, she spent her days helping families navigate crises, finding strength she no longer possessed for herself. Her auburn hair was pulled back in the practical bun she'd worn since her divorce 2 years ago, and her green eyes held the particular weariness that comes from seeing too much pain without enough healing. The house felt too quiet since Tom moved out. Their marriage had crumbled under the weight of unanswered prayers and ungranted wishes, first for children that never came, then for her mother's recovery from the cancer that eventually claimed her. Tom had tried to hold on to faith for both of them, but Grace's anger at God became a wedge that split them apart. He'd moved to the next town over, remarried a woman from his Methodist church, and now had the family he'd always wanted. Grace walked to her living room and picked up her grandmother's worn leather prayer book from the coffee table. The pages fell open to a handwritten note in Nana Catherine's careful script. "Faith isn't about getting what we want, Gracie. It's about trusting that we're loved, even when we can't see it." Below the note, her grandmother had written the date, just 2 weeks before she died, peacefully in her sleep at 87. Nana Catherine had been the strongest person Grace had ever known. Born in Ireland, she'd immigrated to America. As a young bride, raised 6 children through the Depression, buried her husband at 45, and never once complained about God's plan. She'd been the one who taught Grace to pray, who'd knelt beside her bed every night during childhood visits, whose weathered hands had held Grace's own as they whispered the rosary together. The Virgin Mary statue had belonged to Catherine's mother, brought from County Cork in 1898. It was carved from porcelain by an artisan whose name was lost to time, but whose skill had captured something transcendent in the serene face and gentle hands. For 5 generations, the statue had watched over births, deaths, marriages, and sorrows. It had survived 2 world wars, the Irish Troubles, economic hardship, and family upheavals, but it hadn't survived Grace's crisis of faith. She'd stopped praying the day her mother died. Patricia Whitfield had been 58, a devout woman who'd never missed Sunday Mass, never spoke ill of anyone, and who'd spent her final months praying for healing that never came. Grace had sat by her hospital bed for weeks, bargaining with God, promising everything she had if he would just grant this one miracle. Instead, she'd watched her mother waste away, seen the confusion in Patricia's eyes when the prayers didn't work, heard her whisper, "Why?" with her last breath. That was when Grace decided God was either powerless or cruel, and either way, unworthy of her faith. She'd tried to maintain some connection to her spiritual heritage for Tom's sake, for tradition's sake, but it felt like play acting. The rituals that once brought comfort now felt hollow. Church services became exercises in endurance. The statue's serene expression began to look more like mockery than peace. Mrs. Patterson next door still invited Grace to Sunday services at First Baptist. Bless her heart. The elderly widow had taken it upon herself to pray for Grace's spiritual healing ever since the divorce. Grace appreciated the kindness, but declined politely. She'd had enough of unanswered prayers to last several lifetimes. Her work kept her busy enough to avoid thinking about deeper questions most days. She helped teenagers navigate family conflicts, assisted elderly clients in finding care resources, and guided young mothers through bureaucratic systems designed to help but often hindering instead. She was good at her job because she understood disappointment intimately. She could sit with people in their darkest moments without offering false hope or easy answers. But evenings were different. Evenings brought silence and the weight of questions she couldn't answer. Why had she lost everyone she'd ever loved? Why did some people seem blessed while others suffered endlessly? Why did faith come so easily to some and feel like torture to others? The statue had become the focus of all these questions. Every time she looked at it, she felt the accusation in its painted eyes, not from Mary, but from herself. It represented everything she'd lost, everything she'd believed in vain, every prayer that had echoed back empty. This morning, she'd finally decided to end the torment. She'd found Tom's old blowtorch in the garage, still in the toolbox he'd forgotten when he moved out. The irony wasn't lost on her, using a tool from her failed marriage to destroy a symbol of her failed faith. She opened the prayer book one last time, reading her grandmother's words again. Faith isn't about getting what we want. Maybe Nana Catherine had been wrong. Maybe faith was exactly about getting what you need to survive. And when it failed to deliver, it became nothing more than pretty stories told to make people feel better about an indifferent universe. Grace closed the book and walked toward the back door. It was almost noon. Time to put an end to 5 generations of unanswered prayers and finally admit what she'd known for months. There was no one listening. There had never been anyone listening, and the sooner she accepted that truth, the sooner she could learn to live with it. The statue waited on the wooden table, its face turned toward the autumn sky, as if expecting something. Grace picked up the blowtorch, checked the fuel level, and prepared to close this chapter of her life forever. She had no way of knowing that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise. Grace stood on her back porch, blowtorch in hand, feeling the weight of 5 generations pressing down on her shoulders. The October sun was directly overhead, casting sharp shadows across her small yard. The Virgin Mary statue sat on the old wooden table, its porcelain surface catching the light in ways that made it seem almost alive. She'd rehearsed this moment in her mind for weeks, but now that it was here, her hands trembled. This wasn't just about destroying a statue, it was about severing the last connection to a faith that had defined her family for over a century. Her great-great-grandmother had carried this statue across an ocean, believing it would protect her descendants. Her grandmother had clutched it during the London Blitz, whispering prayers for safety that somehow kept her alive when others perished. But what protection had it offered Grace? Where was the divine intervention when her mother lay dying? Where was the blessing when her marriage crumbled? Where was the comfort when she knelt alone in an empty house, begging a silent sky for just one sign that someone was listening? She pressed the ignition button. The torch came to life with a sharp hiss, the blue flame dancing in the still air. The heat felt good on her face, real, tangible, honest. Not like the phantom warmth of answered prayers that never came. Sorry, Nana, she whispered, raising the torch toward the statue. "But this has to end." The flame touched the porcelain, and Grace expected to see the delicate features begin to soften and melt. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The statue didn't crumble or blacken under the intense heat. Instead, it began to glow, not the harsh reflection of flame, but a soft, inner light that seemed to emanate from within the porcelain itself. Grace jerked the torch back, startled. The glow remained, growing brighter rather than dimmer. She could feel warmth radiating from the statue, but not the burning heat of fire, something gentler, more encompassing. It was the kind of warmth she remembered from childhood Sunday mornings, snuggled against her grandmother during early Mass, feeling safe and loved and part of something larger than herself. What the... She stepped backward, nearly dropping the torch. The statue's glow intensified, casting soft shadows across the porch. Grace's rational mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe the porcelain had some unusual mineral content that reacted to heat. Maybe there was a reflection from the neighbor's windows, causing an optical illusion. Maybe the stress of the past few months was finally catching up with her, and she was having some kind of breakdown. But even as she tried to rationalize what she was seeing, something deeper was happening. The warmth from the statue wasn't just touching her skin. It was reaching into places that had been cold for years. She felt a flutter of something she'd almost forgotten existed. Peace. Then came the vision. It lasted only seconds. But in that brief moment, Grace saw through different eyes. She was standing in a different yard, in front of a different house, but she was holding the same statue. The woman whose perspective she shared had weathered hands and spoke with an Irish accent, praying in a voice Grace recognized from childhood stories. Her great-great-grandmother Bridget, holding the statue on her first day in America, thanking God for safe passage and asking for protection for her children and her children's children. The vision ended as suddenly as it began, leaving Grace gasping and disoriented. The statue continued to glow, its light now visible even in the bright afternoon sun. Grace's heart pounded against her ribs as she tried to process what had just occurred. She reached out tentatively, then pulled her hand back. Every rational part of her mind was screaming that this was impossible, that statues didn't glow, that dead relatives didn't share their memories across time. But the evidence was right in front of her, undeniable and beautiful and terrifying. The glow began to fade after several minutes, but the warmth remained. Grace found herself unable to look away from the statue's face. Had the expression changed slightly? Did the painted eyes seem more alive, more knowing, or was she simply seeing what her desperate mind wanted to see? She set the torch down carefully and sank into the wooden chair beside the table. Her hand shook as she tried to light a cigarette, a habit she'd picked up after the divorce and never quite managed to quit. The flame from her lighter looked pale and ordinary compared to what she'd just witnessed. "This isn't real," she said, aloud, as if speaking the words would make them true. "This is stress. This is grief. This is anything but what it looks like." But the statue sat there, serene and unchanged, except for the lingering warmth that Grace could still feel from 3 feet away. She finished her cigarette in silence, unable to take her eyes off the porcelain figure that had somehow resisted destruction and responded with light. As the afternoon wore on, Grace found herself recounting every detail of what had happened, testing her memory against the impossibility of it all. She'd felt the heat from the torch. She'd seen the blue flame touch the statue's surface. She'd actually watched, the porcelain begin to glow from within. And that vision of her ancestor, so vivid and real that she could still smell the ocean salt and feel the rough wool of Bridget's shawl. When evening came, Grace brought the statue back inside, handling it with a reverence she hadn't felt in years. She placed it on her kitchen table where she could keep an eye on it, half expecting the supernatural display to resume. But the statue remained normal, or what she had always considered normal. That night, Her dreams were unlike anything she'd experienced since childhood. She saw faces she didn't recognize, but somehow knew. Generations of women who had knelt before this same statue, who had whispered their hopes and fears to these same painted features. She saw her grandmother as a young mother, desperate with worry during her husband's long illness, clutching the statue while she prayed. She saw her own mother as a child, making her first communion, promising the Virgin Mary that she would always be faithful. And she saw herself, not as she was now, angry and faithless, but as she had been at 7 years old, kneeling beside her grandmother's bed, completely trusting that her prayers were heard and valued, and would somehow make a difference in the world. Grace woke before dawn, tears streaming down her face. The statue sat innocently on her kitchen table, showing no signs of the previous day's miracle. But something fundamental had shifted inside her. The crushing weight of certainty. Certainty that nothing mattered, that no one was listening, that faith was just elaborate self-deception, had lifted slightly. She didn't know what to make of what had happened. She couldn't bring herself to believe it was divine intervention, but she couldn't dismiss it as imagination either. All she knew was that for the first time in years, she felt curious about something beyond her own pain, and that curiosity scared her almost as much as it intrigued her. Pastor Thomas Brennan had been shepherding souls at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church for 12 years, and in all that time, he'd never encountered anything quite like the woman who sat across from his desk that Thursday afternoon. Grace Whitfield. He appeared composed on the surface, professionally dressed, articulate, clearly intelligent, but there was something in her eyes that spoke of recent upheaval, the kind that left people questioning everything they thought they knew about the world. Thomas was 52, with graying temples and the kind of gentle presence that made people want to confess their troubles. He'd built his reputation on being a steady voice of reason in times of crisis, someone who could offer comfort without judgment and guidance without condemnation. His congregation trusted him because he never pretended to have all the answers, but he always seemed to know the right questions to ask. "I'm not sure why I'm here," Grace began, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "I'm not even sure I believe in, well, any of this anymore." Thomas nodded, accustomed to such opening statements. "Doubt isn't the enemy of faith, Mrs. Whitfield. Often it's the beginning of a deeper understanding." She looked at him with surprise, as if she'd expected condemnation rather than acceptance. "I was raised Catholic, haven't been to Mass in years, haven't prayed in longer than that. I'm probably the last person who should be sitting in a pastor's office. And yet, here you are." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his wooden cross pendant, a simple piece he'd worn since seminary, resting against his chest. "What brought you to my door today?" Grace hesitated, clearly wrestling with how much to reveal. Thomas had seen this internal struggle countless times, people standing at the edge of vulnerability, trying to decide whether it was safe to jump. "Something happened," she said finally. "Something I can't explain, something that shouldn't be possible." Thomas felt an unusual warmth against his chest. He glanced down, puzzled. His cross pendant, carved from olive wood he'd brought back from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem years ago, seemed to be radiating heat. He'd worn it every day for over a decade, and had never experienced anything like it. "Tell me about it," he said. Trying to ignore the growing warmth, Grace took a deep breath. "I have had my grandmother's statue, Virgin Mary. It's been in our family for generations. Tuesday, I decided to destroy it. I was angry, fed up with prayer and faith and all of it. I used a blowtorch." Thomas raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "It didn't burn," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Instead, it started to glow. Real light, not just reflection. And I felt—" She paused, struggling with the words. "I felt warm, not from the torch, but from the statue, and I saw things, memories that weren't mine. The cross pendant was now noticeably warm against Thomas's chest. He'd counseled hundreds of people through spiritual crises, heard stories of perceived miracles that usually had rational explanations. But something about Grace's account felt different. The sincerity in her voice, the confusion rather than evangelical fervor, the way she seemed to be fighting against her own experience rather than embracing it. "What kind of memories?" he asked. "My ancestor, the woman who brought the statue from Ireland. I saw through her eyes, felt what she felt." Grace's hands trembled slightly. "This is crazy, isn't it? You think I'm having some kind of breakdown?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, feeling the unusual warmth from his cross and studying Grace's face. In his 12 years of ministry, he'd developed a sense for when people were fabricating stories for attention, versus when they were genuinely grappling with something beyond their understanding. Everything about Grace suggested the latter. "I think," he said carefully, "that you've experienced something significant. Whether it has a spiritual explanation or some other cause, it's clearly affected you deeply. That's what matters, right?" "Now," Grace looked at him with surprise, "you don't think I'm crazy? I think you're troubled. I think you're searching for answers to questions that don't have easy solutions. That doesn't make you crazy, it makes you human, for the first time." Since she'd entered his office, Grace smiled slightly. "Most people would tell me I imagined it. Stress, grief, wishful thinking. What do you think? I don't know what to think. That's why I'm here, I suppose. I was hoping you might have some insight into—" She gestured vaguely. "Into whatever this was." Thomas felt his cross growing warmer still. The sensation was so pronounced now that he wondered if Grace could see the heat affecting his clothing. But she showed no sign of noticing anything unusual. "Have you experienced anything like this before?" he asked. "Never. I've been angry at God for years. If anything supernatural was going to happen, you'd think it would have been when I was still praying, still believing. Not when I was trying to burn away the last piece of faith I had left." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the most profound spiritual experiences come not when we're seeking them, but when we're running from them. The divine has a way of meeting us in our rebellion, not just our surrender. Do you really believe that? Or is that just something you say to comfort people?" The question caught Thomas off guard with its directness. He was used to people accepting his pastoral platitudes without challenge. Grace's skeptical gaze demanded honesty, not comfort. "I believe it," he said, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "Though I'll admit, your experience is unlike anything I've encountered in my ministry." They sat in silence for a moment. Thomas found himself genuinely curious about this woman and her impossible story. The rational part of his mind suggested that she was dealing with grief and stress in ways that manifested as hallucinations. But the warmth from his cross suggested something else entirely, that perhaps the spiritual world was more active and immediate than his seminary training had prepared him to understand. "Would you be willing to let me visit your home?" he asked impulsively. "To see this statue for myself?" Grace looked startled by the request. "Why would you want to do that?" Thomas touched the cross beneath his shirt, feeling its unusual warmth. "Call it pastoral curiosity. If something extraordinary has happened, I'd like to understand it better. If it hasn't, then perhaps I can help you process what you're going through in other ways. You think you'll be able to tell the difference?" "I think I'll know it when I see it." Grace studied his face for a long moment. "All right. But I warn you, if nothing happens, if the statue just sits there being normal, I'm going to feel very foolish. And if something does happen, then I suppose we'll both have some explaining to do." As Grace left his office, Thomas remained seated, his hand pressed against his cross. The warmth was already beginning to fade, but the memory of it lingered. In 12 years of ministry, he'd never experienced anything that challenged his understanding of how God worked in the world. His faith had been steady, institutional, built on doctrine and tradition rather than mystical experience. But something about Grace Whitfield had awakened a curiosity he hadn't felt since his early days in seminary. when everything about faith had seemed mysterious and full of possibility. He found himself looking forward to visiting her home, not just as a pastor doing his duty, but as someone genuinely interested in discovering whether the supernatural was more present in daily life than he'd ever imagined. That night, Thomas had the most vivid dreams he'd experienced in years. Images of fire and light, of faces he didn't recognize but somehow knew, of a presence both ancient and immediate. He woke feeling as though something fundamental in his understanding of faith was beginning to shift, and he wasn't entirely sure whether that prospect thrilled or terrified him. The weekend brought no relief from the strange experiences that had begun with the glowing statue. Grace found herself jumping at shadows, startled by the way objects seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. A coffee mug would be on one side of the counter when she left the kitchen, then appear on the other side when she returned. Books fell open to passages about faith and miracles. The temperature in her house fluctuated without explanation, warm spots appearing and disappearing like invisible presences moving through her home. Saturday evening, she drove to Restwood Cemetery, where her mother lay buried beside her father. Grace hadn't visited since the funeral 2 years ago. The grief had been too raw, the silence from heaven too deafening. But now, carrying questions she couldn't answer alone, she knelt beside the headstone and whispered her first prayer in months. "Mom, I don't know what's happening to me. I don't know if you can hear this, if anyone can hear this, but I need help." The vision came instantly, more vivid than the first. She was no longer kneeling in the cemetery, but standing in her grandmother's kitchen, watching Nana Catherine as a young woman, maybe 30 years old. Catherine was holding the Virgin Mary statue, tears streaming down her face as she prayed in desperate whispers. Grace could feel her grandmother's anguish. Her husband was dying of tuberculosis. She had 3 young children, and the bills were mounting. But even in her desperation, Catherine's faith never wavered. She believed her prayers mattered, that someone was listening, that love existed beyond human understanding. The vision shifted. Grace saw her grandmother years later, now elderly, kneeling beside the same statue during Grace's mother's difficult birth. She saw Catherine praying for her granddaughter Grace when she was born premature, saw her whispering gratitude when Grace survived her first difficult year. Generation after generation of women had brought their fears and hopes to this same statue, and somehow their combined faith had created something more powerful than individual belief. When the vision ended, Grace was lying on the grass beside her grandmother's headstone, tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of grief, they were tears of recognition. She was connected to something larger than her own pain, part of a spiritual lineage that stretched back through time. Grace stood up with a new sense of purpose. It was time to reclaim what had been taken from her family, what had been taken from anyone whose spiritual experience didn't fit neatly into established religious categories. She called Thomas that evening. "I'd like to take you up on that offer. To visit, there are things happening I can't explain." Thomas arrived at her house that afternoon, and Grace could see the change in him immediately. The composed, pastoral demeanor was still there, but underneath it, she sensed excitement and uncertainty in equal measure. "Has anything else happened since we talked?" he asked as she led him to the kitchen where the statue sat. "Things move when I'm not looking. The house gets warm in spots for no reason, and I had another vision, more detailed this time." Thomas nodded, his hand unconsciously moving to his chest. Grace noticed the gesture and wondered what he wasn't telling her. When they entered the kitchen, the statue appeared perfectly normal, beautiful, serene, but utterly ordinary. Grace felt a flush of embarrassment. "I know it looks like nothing special. Maybe I was just—" She didn't finish the sentence. The statue was beginning to glow. Thomas stepped backward, his eyes wide. The soft light emanated from within the porcelain, just as Grace had described, growing brighter with each passing second. But more than that, Thomas could feel the warmth she'd mentioned, a gentle heat that seemed to penetrate his chest and settle around his heart. His wooden cross pendant was burning against his skin, not with pain, but with the same supernatural warmth that filled the room. "Dear God," he whispered, and for the first time in years, the phrase felt like a prayer rather than an expression. Grace watched his face, seeing her own amazement reflected there. "You can see it too." "Yes." Thomas's voice was barely audible. "I can see it, I can feel it." The glow intensified, and suddenly both of them were experiencing the same vision. They stood together in a small Irish cottage, watching as a young woman carefully wrapped the statue in cloth, preparing for the journey to America. But this wasn't Grace's great-great-grandmother. This was someone earlier, the original owner of the statue. The woman was a mystic, someone who saw beyond the ordinary world into realms of spirit and divine presence. She had been persecuted by the local authorities, accused of witchcraft for her ability to heal through prayer and her claims of visions. As she wrapped the statue, she whispered a blessing that would protect her descendants, that would awaken their spiritual gifts. When they were most needed, the vision ended, leaving Grace and Thomas staring at each other in the soft glow of the statue. "This isn't just about you," Thomas said quietly. "This is about awakening something that's been dormant for generations." Later that week, Grace was making routine visits to clients when she stopped by Millbrook General Hospital to check on an elderly man whose family was struggling with care decisions. As she walked through the chapel, a small, non-denominational room meant to offer comfort to people of all faiths, one of the votive candles spontaneously burst into flame. Grace stared at the candle, then around the empty chapel. She hadn't been near enough to accidentally light it, and there was no one else present who could have done so. But as she watched the flame dance, she felt the same warmth she'd experienced with the statue. That evening, she called Thomas. "It's not just the statue anymore. Things are happening everywhere I go." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Grace, I think we need to consider the possibility that this is just the beginning." Thomas spent the week after witnessing the statue's glow immersed in research. The diocesan archives held records dating back to the founding of St. Matthew's in 1887, but Thomas was looking for something more specific. Any mention of the Whitfield family or unusual spiritual phenomena in the area. What he found surprised him. Grace's family had been part of the original congregation, founding members who had contributed significantly to the church's construction. But there were also notes, written in careful clerical script, about concerning developments and unorthodox practices associated with the family name. According to a journal kept by the church's second pastor, Grace's great-great-grandmother, Bridget, had been quietly asked to leave the congregation after other parishioners complained about disturbing occurrences during services. The pastor had noted that candles would light spontaneously when she entered the sanctuary, that she seemed to know things about people's lives that she couldn't possibly know, and that her presence during prayer seemed to intensify whatever the congregation was experiencing. The more Thomas read, the more he realized that Grace's recent experiences weren't entirely unprecedented. They were part of a pattern that stretched back 4 generations, a spiritual sensitivity that the institutional church had repeatedly tried to suppress rather than understand. Meanwhile, Grace's life was becoming increasingly complicated by manifestations she couldn't control. During a routine family mediation session, she suddenly knew things about the feuding siblings that they hadn't told her. Childhood traumas, hidden resentments, the real reasons behind their dispute. Her insights were so accurate that the session ended with a breakthrough that typically took months to achieve. At the grocery store, she found herself comforting a young mother who was crying in the cereal aisle, somehow knowing that the woman had just received news of her husband's deployment. In the bank, she noticed an elderly man whose hands were shaking, and without thinking, she approached him and mentioned the name Dorothy. The man broke into tears. Dorothy had been his wife. who died the previous month, and he'd been struggling with loneliness. Grace's simple acknowledgement of his grief gave him comfort he hadn't felt since the funeral. Word began to spread through the small community that Grace Whitfield had some kind of gift. People started seeking her out, asking for guidance, or simply wanting to be in her presence. Grace found it overwhelming and wonderful in equal measure. She was helping people in ways she'd never been able to before. But she didn't understand how or why. The most dramatic incident occurred on a Wednesday evening. Grace was walking past St. Matthew's on her way home from work when the church bell began to ring. This was unusual. The bell was only rung for services, weddings, and funerals, and there was nothing scheduled that evening. As Grace approached the building, the ringing grew more insistent. She found the front door unlocked, which was also unusual for a weekday evening. Inside, the sanctuary was empty but filled with an unusual warmth. As Grace walked down the center aisle, the bell continued to ring as if calling her forward. She knelt in the front pew, and immediately the ringing stopped. In the sudden silence, she heard footsteps. Thomas emerged from the vestry, his face pale with amazement. "I was in my office when the bell started ringing," he said. "When I came to investigate, I found the bell rope moving by itself. Then I saw you through the window." "It was calling me," Grace said, surprised by her own certainty. "I could feel it." Then Thomas sat beside her in the pew. "Grace, I need to tell you something. I've been researching your family's history with this church. Your ancestor didn't leave by choice. She was asked to leave because the congregation found her spiritual gifts disturbing." Grace turned to face him. "What kind of gifts?" "The same things you're experiencing. Spontaneous phenomena, insights about people's lives, an ability to bring comfort and healing through her presence. The church leadership at the time couldn't understand it, so they treated it as dangerous." They sat in silence for several minutes, contemplating the implications. Grace was experiencing something that ran in her family line, something that had been suppressed for over a century. "What do you think it means?" Grace asked. Thomas looked around the sanctuary, thinking of how different it felt with Grace present. The space seemed more alive, more filled with presence than it had during any of his regular services. "I think it means the church made a mistake a long time ago, and maybe it's time to correct it." The following Sunday, Thomas's sermon took an unexpected turn. Instead of his planned discussion of stewardship, he found himself talking about the difference between institutional faith and experiential faith, about how the church had sometimes been more afraid of divine presence than welcoming of it. Several parishioners approached him afterward, expressing concern about the unusual direction his preaching had taken lately. The church board scheduled a meeting to discuss pastoral concerns and the theological soundness of his recent messages. Thomas realized he was standing at a crossroads. He could return to safe conventional ministry and pretend nothing had changed, or he could pursue the questions that Grace's experiences had raised about the nature of faith and spiritual reality. That evening, he knelt in his own living room and prayed more honestly than he had in years. He asked not for guidance on what would be safe for his career, but for courage to follow truth wherever it led, even if it challenged everything he thought he knew about how God worked in the world. News travels fast in a town of 8,000 people, and by October's end, Grace Whitfield had become the subject of intense speculation and divided opinion. Half the community viewed her as someone blessed with extraordinary spiritual gifts, while the other half whispered about everything from mental illness to demonic influence. The grocery store checkout line became a battleground of opinions. Mrs. Patterson defended Grace fiercely, telling anyone who would listen about how Grace had helped her find her lost wedding ring by somehow knowing it had fallen behind the water heater. But Harold Vance from the hardware store countered with concerns about ungodly practices and the need to protect the community from dangerous influences. Grace tried to maintain her normal routine, but it became increasingly difficult. 1. Work. Clients specifically requested her services, claiming she understood their situations in ways other social workers couldn't. Her supervisor, initially skeptical, became a believer after Grace helped locate a runaway teenager by describing a location she'd seen in a vision, an abandoned barn 15 miles outside town where the girl was indeed found, safe but scared. The most dramatic incident occurred during a missing person case. 8-year-old Tommy Rodriguez had wandered away from his family's campsite at Miller's Lake and hadn't been seen for 6 hours. Search parties were combing the woods as darkness fell, and the family was growing desperate. Grace arrived with one of the search parties and immediately felt drawn toward the eastern shore of the lake, away from where everyone else was looking. She followed the feeling, walking through dense underbrush until she reached a small cave formation that wasn't visible from the main trails. Inside, she found Tommy, unharmed but too frightened and cold to call out. The rescue made local headlines. And suddenly, Grace wasn't just a local curiosity. She was someone who could save lives. Meanwhile, St. Matthew's was experiencing its own transformation. During Sunday services, strange things began happening with increasing frequency. The most notable was the stained glass window depicting the Virgin Mary, which had been cracked for over a decade due to settling in the church's foundation. Members of the congregation began noticing that the cracks were healing themselves, slowly but visibly, particularly when Grace was present for services. Thomas found himself caught between wonder and institutional pressure. The church board had grown increasingly concerned about his unorthodox approach to ministry and the strange occurrences that seemed to follow wherever Grace went. Board chairman Robert Hayes expressed the concerns of many when he pulled Thomas aside after a particularly eventful service. "Pastor, we need to talk about the Whitfield woman. People are getting spooked. Some folks are saying she's got some kind of supernatural powers, others are worried about witchcraft. Either way, it's causing division in the congregation." Thomas had expected this conversation. "Robert, I've witnessed some of these events myself. I can't explain them scientifically, but I also can't deny that they're happening. Maybe instead of being afraid, we should be asking what God is trying to teach us. God doesn't work through fortune tellers and psychics, Thomas. He works through scripture, tradition, and prayer. What's happening here isn't biblical, isn't it?" Thomas challenged. "What about the gifts of the Spirit Paul writes about? What about the miracles in Acts? When did we decide that God stopped working in supernatural ways?" The conversation ended with Robert warning Thomas that his position at St. Matthew's might be in jeopardy if he continued to encourage what the board viewed as dangerous theological deviation. That same week, Grace experienced her most powerful vision yet. While visiting her grandmother's grave, something she'd begun doing regularly since the experiences started, she was suddenly transported into what felt like a different time period. Altogether, she found herself in a courtroom from the 1890s, watching as her great-great-grandmother Bridget stood before a church tribunal. The charges were blasphemy and practicing witchcraft, based on testimony from congregation members who claimed she could predict deaths, heal illnesses through prayer, and cause supernatural phenomena during worship services. Grace watched as Bridget defended herself with dignity and grace, explaining that her gifts came from God and were meant to serve others. But the church officials were afraid of anything they couldn't control or understand. They banished her from the congregation and warned other churches in the area not to accept her family. The vision was so vivid that Grace could smell the wood smoke from the courtroom's fireplace, could hear the scratch of the court recorder's pen, could feel Bridget's heartbreak as she was rejected by the very community she had tried to serve. When the vision ended, Grace was lying on the grass beside her grandmother's headstone, tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of understanding. She finally comprehended why her family's spiritual gifts had been dormant for so long. They had been suppressed by fear and institutional control, passed down through generations. who learned to hide their sensitivity rather than celebrate it. Grace stood up with a new sense of purpose. It was time to reclaim what had been taken from her family, what had been taken from anyone whose spiritual experience didn't fit neatly into established religious categories. She called Thomas that evening. "I know what I need to do, but I'll need your help. What are you thinking? I want to tell the truth. All of it. I want to stand up in that church and tell everyone about my great-great-grandmother, about what really happened to our family, about why these gifts were hidden for over a century." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Grace, if you do that, there will be consequences for both of us." "I know, but I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of pretending this isn't real. And I think there are other people in our community who have similar experiences but are afraid to talk about them because they think they'll be judged or rejected." "You're probably right about that. So will you help me? Will you give me a chance to speak to the congregation?" Thomas thought about his conversation with Robert Hayes, about the warnings he'd received, about the comfortable life he'd built within the safe boundaries of institutional ministry. Then he thought about the stained glass window healing itself, about the look in Grace's eyes when she'd helped find Tommy Rodriguez, about the warmth of his wooden cross whenever something supernatural was happening. "Yes," he said finally, "I'll help you, whatever comes of it." They spent the next several days planning what Grace would say and how Thomas would introduce her testimony. They both knew they were taking an enormous risk. Grace could be dismissed as mentally ill or spiritually deluded, and Thomas could lose his position. But they also knew that something important was happening, something that deserved to be acknowledged and understood rather than feared and suppressed. The night before Grace was scheduled to speak, Thomas had the most intense spiritual experience of his life. He was praying in the empty sanctuary when he felt a presence so strong and loving that it brought him to tears. It wasn't the distant theological God he'd learned about in seminary. It was an immediate, personal presence that filled him with peace and certainty. In that moment, Thomas understood that his entire ministry up to that point had been preparation for this moment. All his years of conventional preaching, all his careful adherence to doctrine and tradition had been building toward this opportunity to stand up for something real and transformative. Meanwhile, Grace spent the evening with her grandmother's statue, which had been glowing softly for hours. She felt surrounded by the presence of all the women who had come before her, all the ones who had hidden their gifts, and all the ones who had paid the price for using them openly. As she prepared for bed, she whispered a prayer to her great-great-grandmother. "Bridget, tomorrow I'm going to finish what you started. I'm going to tell the truth no matter what happens." The statue's glow intensified for just a moment, and Grace took it as a sign of approval from across the generations. Sunday morning dawned grey and cold, with the kind of October sky that promised rain before evening. Grace dressed carefully, in her best blue dress, the one she'd worn to her mother's funeral, and placed her grandmother's Virgin Mary statue in a small carrying case. Today, she would bring it to church for the first time in years. Thomas had spent the early morning in prayer and final preparation. He'd informed the church board the previous evening that he would be introducing a special testimony during the service, though he hadn't provided details. Several board members had expressed concern, but Thomas had been firm. This was something that needed to happen. The sanctuary filled with the usual congregation, plus a number of people who had heard rumors about what might occur. Grace sat in the front pew, the carrying case beside her, trying to steady her nerves. She'd spoken publicly many times in her professional capacity, but this felt entirely different. This was about exposing her deepest experiences to a group of people who might reject everything she had to say. Thomas began the service with conventional hymns and prayers, but Grace could sense an undercurrent of expectation in the room. During the time normally reserved for the sermon, Thomas approached the pulpit with visible emotion. "Before I introduce today's speaker," he began, "I want to share something I discovered this week in our church archives." He opened a folder containing Photocopied documents. In 1893, this congregation made a decision that I believe we need to acknowledge and address. A woman named Bridget O'Sullivan, who later became Bridget Whitfield, was asked to leave our church because of what were described as disturbing supernatural occurrences associated with her presence. A murmur ran through the congregation. Grace felt her heart racing. Thomas continued reading from the historical documents. According to the records, Mrs. O'Sullivan had what we might now recognize as spiritual gifts, the ability to provide comfort and healing, insights that helped people in crisis, and a presence that seemed to intensify the spiritual experience of worship. Rather than trying to understand these gifts or integrate them into our community's spiritual life, our predecessors chose to exile her and her family. The murmur grew louder. Several people were whispering to their neighbors, and Grace could see disapproval on some faces. "I'm telling you this," Thomas said, raising his voice slightly, "because Mrs. O'Sullivan's great-great-granddaughter is with us today, and she has experienced a spiritual awakening that I believe is connected to what happened here over a century ago. Grace Whitfield has something to share with us that challenges our assumptions about how God works in the world." As Grace rose from her pew, carrying case in hand, she could feel the tension in the room. Some people were leaning forward with curiosity. Others were sitting back with obvious skepticism or concern. She placed the carrying case on the communion table and opened it, revealing the Virgin Mary statue. Even in the dim light of the cloudy morning, it seemed to glow slightly, though Grace wasn't sure if others could see it. "My name is Grace Whitfield," she began, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Most of you know me as a social worker, someone who helps families in crisis. What you don't know is that 3 weeks ago I tried to destroy this statue, the same statue my great-great-grandmother brought from Ireland in 1898. She told her story simply and honestly, her loss of faith, her anger at unanswered prayers, the moment when she'd tried to burn the statue and it had responded with light instead of destruction. She described the visions, the increasing spiritual sensitivity, the ways she'd been able to help people through insights she couldn't explain. As she spoke, something remarkable began to happen. The statue's glow became visible to everyone in the sanctuary, growing brighter with each word Grace spoke. People gasped, pointed, whispered prayers and curses in equal measure. "I know how this sounds," Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. As the statue's light filled the room, "I know it challenges everything we think we know about how the spiritual world works. But I also know that what happened to my ancestor was wrong. She was rejected because her gifts didn't fit into neat theological categories. She was punished for experiencing God in ways that made other people uncomfortable." The statue was now glowing so brightly that it illuminated the entire front of the sanctuary. Several people in the back rows stood up, some to get a better look, others apparently preparing to leave. Thomas stepped forward, his own wooden cross now visibly warm against his chest. "What you're witnessing," he said, "challenges all of us to reconsider our understanding of how the divine operates in our world. We can respond with fear, as our predecessors did, or we can respond with openness to the possibility that God's ways are more mysterious and immediate than we've been taught to believe." That's when Bishop Harrison stood up. Grace hadn't noticed him enter during the service, hadn't realized that someone from the diocese was present to witness her testimony. Bishop Harrison was a tall, austere man in his 60s, known for his theological conservatism and strict interpretation of episcopal doctrine. "This is enough," he said, his voice carrying easily through the sanctuary. "What we're witnessing here is not divine revelation. It's religious hysteria combined with what might charitably be called elaborate stage magic." The bishop walked toward the front of the church, his ceremonial ring catching the light from the glowing statue. "Pastor Brennan, you have clearly lost sight of your pastoral duties. And Mrs. Whitfield, while I sympathize with whatever psychological crisis you're experiencing. I cannot allow this congregation to be deceived by claims of miraculous phenomena." Grace felt a moment of crushing doubt. Here was the highest religious authority most of these people would ever encounter, and he was dismissing everything she'd experienced and shared. But then she looked at the statue, still glowing with peaceful light, and she felt the presence of all the women who had come before her. "With respect, Bishop Harrison," she said quietly, "you're making the same mistake this church made a century ago. You're choosing fear over wonder, control over authentic spiritual experience." The bishop's expression hardened. "I'm choosing orthodoxy over delusion, Mrs. Whitfield, and I'm choosing to protect this congregation from dangerous influences." As he spoke, something extraordinary happened. The bishop's ceremonial ring, a large silver piece set with an amethyst, worn by diocesan bishops for over a century, began to lose its luster. The silver grew dull, the amethyst clouded, and the ring itself seemed to grow cold on his finger. At the same time, Grace's statue blazed with light so intense that several people had to shield their eyes. The warmth it radiated could be felt throughout the entire sanctuary, and the damaged stained glass window behind the altar began to repair itself visibly, the cracks sealing as everyone watched. The confrontation in the sanctuary had lasted only 20 minutes, but its aftermath would reshape the entire community. By Monday morning, word of what had happened at St. Matthew's had spread throughout Millbrook and beyond. Social media posts, phone calls, and local news coverage transformed Sunday service into a regional story that drew curiosity seekers, skeptics, and spiritual pilgrims from across the state. Grace woke to find reporters camping outside her house and her phone ringing constantly with interview requests. She'd unplugged her landline and turned off her cell phone, but the attention was overwhelming. Mrs. Patterson knocked on her door at 8 in the morning with coffee and moral support. "Don't you let them make you feel ashamed of what happened yesterday," the elderly woman said firmly. "I've been going to that church for 40 years, and I've never felt the presence of God as strongly as I did when that statue was glowing. Whatever Bishop Harrison says, I know what I experienced." Thomas's situation was more precarious. He'd been summoned to an emergency meeting with diocesan officials, and there was little doubt that his position at St. Matthew's was in jeopardy. But instead of feeling afraid, he felt liberated. For the first time in his ministry, he'd witnessed something that made his faith feel real rather than theoretical. He spent Monday morning in prayer and reflection, preparing for what he knew would be the most important conversation of his professional life. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday at the diocesan headquarters, 40 miles away in the state capital. Bishop Harrison would be present, along with several other church officials who would determine whether Thomas could continue in ministry. The community, meanwhile, was divided more sharply than ever. A hastily organized prayer meeting Monday evening at First Baptist drew over 200 people who wanted to pray for protection from what they saw as dangerous supernatural influences. But an equally large group gathered in the town park to show support for Grace and to share their own stories of unexplained spiritual experiences. Grace was surprised by how many people approached her with their own accounts of encounters that couldn't be easily explained. Dreams that came true, healings that defied medical explanation, moments of knowing things they couldn't possibly know. It seemed as though her public testimony had given permission for others to acknowledge experiences they'd kept hidden for years. Tuesday morning, Grace made a decision that surprised even herself. She would attend Thomas's meeting with the diocesan officials. She would bring her grandmother's statue, and she would advocate for the pastor who had risked his career to support her. She called Thomas at 6 in the morning. "I want to come with you today." "Grace, that's not necessary. This is an internal church matter now." "No, it's not. This is about the same thing that happened to my family a century ago. I won't let it happen again without fighting back." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You understand that your presence might make things worse for both of us, or it might make things better. Either way, I'm not hiding anymore." They drove to the diocesan headquarters together, the Virgin Mary statue carefully wrapped and placed in the back seat of Thomas's car. During the hour-long drive, they talked about their hopes and fears for what lay ahead. "What's the best outcome you can imagine?" Grace asked. Thomas considered the question. "That they recognize what we've experienced as authentic spiritual phenomenon and find a way to integrate it into the Church's understanding of how God works. And the worst, that I lose my ordination. You're labeled as mentally ill or demonically influenced, and everything goes back to the way it was before." "That's not the worst outcome," Grace said quietly. "What is? That we compromise. That we agree to keep quiet about what we've experienced in exchange for being left alone. That we choose safety over truth." Thomas nodded. "That would be the worst outcome, because then we'd be betraying not just ourselves, but everyone who needs to know that spiritual reality is more immediate and accessible than the Church has taught them to believe." The diocesan headquarters was an imposing granite building that had housed church administration for over a century. As they walked up the front steps, Grace carrying her statue case, Thomas felt the weight of institutional authority and tradition. But he also felt the warmth of his wooden cross and the certainty that they were doing the right thing. Bishop Harrison met them in the conference room, accompanied by 3 other officials. The canon lawyer who would determine if any church law had been violated, the diocesan theologian who would assess the orthodoxy of what had occurred, and a psychiatrist who specialized in religious experiences and would evaluate Grace's mental state. "Mrs. Whitfield," Bishop Harrison began, "I appreciate your loyalty to Pastor Brennan, but this is an internal ecclesiastical matter. Your presence here is inappropriate. With respect, Bishop, this stopped being an internal matter when your church rejected my family a century ago for experiencing the same things I'm experiencing now. I have a right to speak for myself and for my ancestors who were silenced." The canon lawyer leaned forward. "Mrs. Whitfield, we're prepared to acknowledge that your family may have been treated unfairly in the past. But we need to determine whether what's happening now is genuinely spiritual in nature, or whether Pastor Brennan has allowed himself to be deceived by psychological or even fraudulent phenomena." Grace placed her carrying case on the conference table and opened it. The statue sat there quietly, looking like nothing more than a well-made piece of religious art. "I understand your skepticism," Grace said. "A month ago, I would have agreed with you. I was an atheist who tried to destroy this statue because I was angry at the God I no longer believed in." She told her story again, but this time to an audience of educated church officials who listened with professional skepticism. The canon lawyer took notes, the theologian asked questions about the specific nature of her visions, and the psychiatrist observed her demeanor and speech patterns. When Grace finished her account, the room was quiet. The statue remained ordinary-looking, showing no signs of the supernatural phenomena that had awed the congregation at St. Matthew's. "I appreciate your sincerity, Mrs. Whitfield," the theologian said finally, "but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. What you've described could have psychological explanations, or might be the result of suggestion and wishful thinking." That's when the statue began to glow. The soft light began at the base of the Virgin Mary statue and spread upward until the entire figure was luminous with the same gentle radiance that had amazed the congregation at St. Matthew's. The 4 church officials stared in stunned silence as the impossible became undeniably real in their sterile conference room. Canon lawyer Davidson dropped his pen. Theologian Reynolds leaned back in his chair, as if trying to distance himself from what he was seeing. The psychiatrist, Dr. Morgan, reached toward the statue, then pulled her hand back as she felt the warmth radiating from it. Bishop Harrison stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is—" He stopped, apparently unable to find words for what he was witnessing. Grace felt a familiar peace settling over her as the statue's light filled the room. "This is what my great-great-grandmother experienced. This is what your predecessors rejected, because they couldn't control it or explain it. The glow intensified, and suddenly everyone in the room was sharing the same vision. They found themselves in the Irish countryside, watching as a young woman knelt before the same statue in a small stone church. But this woman wasn't just praying. She was surrounded by people seeking healing, comfort, and guidance. Her spiritual gifts had made her a beacon of hope in her community, someone who could bridge the gap between human suffering and divine love. The vision shifted to show the same woman's persecution by religious authorities who feared her influence, her eventual exile from Ireland, and her journey to America, carrying the statue that had become the focus of her spiritual power. When the vision ended, the 5 people in the diocesan conference room sat in profound silence. The statue continued to glow, its light now so bright that it illuminated every corner of the room. Dr. Morgan was the first to speak. In 30 years of studying religious experiences, I've never witnessed anything like this. The shared visual hallucination alone defies psychological explanation. Bishop Harrison walked slowly around the table until he was standing directly in front of the statue. His ceremonial ring, which had dulled during Sunday's service, was now completely tarnished. The silver black and the amethyst clouded beyond recognition. "How is this possible?" he whispered. Thomas stepped forward. "Maybe the question isn't how it's possible, but why it's happening now. What is the spiritual significance of this awakening?" Grace felt the warmth of the statue spreading through her entire body, and with it came a clarity she'd never experienced before. It's happening because the church has forgotten that faith is meant to be lived, not just studied. It's meant to transform lives, not just fill pews. My ancestors' gifts weren't dangerous. They were exactly what the church should have been celebrating and nurturing. The theologian was frantically taking notes. Even if we accept that this phenomenon is genuinely supernatural, we need to consider the theological implications. How do we integrate this into established doctrine? How do we explain it to the faithful without causing chaos or heresy? You don't explain it, Grace said firmly. You experience it. You let it change you instead of trying to control it. Bishop Harrison continued staring at the statue, his worldview crumbling and rebuilding with each passing moment. He'd spent 40 years in ministry believing that God worked through established channels, through scripture and tradition and institutional authority. Now he was witnessing something that bypassed all of those structures and spoke directly to the human heart. "If this is genuine," he said slowly, "if this is truly divine in origin, then we've made a terrible mistake. Not just with your family, Mrs. Whitfield, but in how we've understood the nature of spiritual experience itself." The statue's light began to pulse gently, as if responding to his words. Everyone in the room could feel the rhythm of it, like a spiritual heartbeat that connected them to something infinitely larger than themselves. Thomas placed his hand on the table near the statue, feeling the warmth intensify. What if the mistake we made a century ago was thinking that we could separate the institutional church from the mystical experience of the divine? What if we've been trying to contain something that's meant to be free? Canon Lawyer Davidson looked up from his notes. From a legal standpoint, we have to consider the precedent this sets. If we acknowledge Mrs. Whitfield's experiences as authentic spiritual phenomena, we're opening the door to claims from anyone who believes they've had supernatural encounters. And would that be such a terrible thing? Grace asked. What if there are others out there with similar gifts who've been afraid to speak up because they know they'll be rejected or ridiculed? What if the church has been suppressing exactly the kind of spiritual vitality it claims to promote? Dr. Morgan nodded. Thoughtfully, there's actually research suggesting that mystical experiences are far more common than most people admit. Many individuals have encounters they consider supernatural, but keep them private because they fear social or religious censure. The statue's light reached its peak intensity, and for a moment, the conference room felt like sacred space. The formal atmosphere of institutional decision-making was replaced by something more profound, a sense of being in the presence of the holy. Bishop Harrison removed his tarnished ring and set it on the table. The gesture was symbolic, representing his willingness to let go of the authority and certainty that had defined his ecclesiastical career. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I owe you an apology, not just for my reaction on Sunday, but for representing a system that has repeatedly chosen fear over faith, control over authentic spiritual experience." Grace felt tears streaming down her face, not from sadness, but from a deep sense of vindication, for herself and for all the ancestors whose gifts had been suppressed. "The question now," Thomas said, "is what we do moving forward. How do we honor what's happened here while serving the broader church community?" The statue's light began to stabilize at a warm, steady glow. The crisis point had passed, and now came the more difficult work of integration and transformation. The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours and changed the trajectory of everyone involved. Bishop Harrison, faced with undeniable evidence of supernatural phenomena, began questioning assumptions he'd held throughout his career. The other officials, each approaching the experience through their professional expertise, found their carefully constructed frameworks inadequate to contain what they'd witnessed. Dr. Morgan was perhaps the most affected. As someone who'd spent decades studying religious experience from a clinical perspective, she'd always maintained professional detachment from the phenomena she researched. But sharing the vision of Grace's ancestor had given her a first-hand encounter with the divine that transformed her understanding of both psychology and spirituality. "What we need to consider," she said, "is that genuine mystical experience has been documented throughout human history. Every major religious tradition includes accounts of individuals who served as bridges between the ordinary world and the sacred. The question isn't whether such experiences are real, but how institutions respond to them." Canon Lawyer Davidson raised practical concerns. "Even if we acknowledge the authenticity of Mrs. Whitfield's gifts, we have to consider the implications for church order and authority. If individuals can have direct experiences of the divine that bypass traditional channels, what happens to the role of clergy and institutional guidance?" Thomas smiled. "Maybe that's exactly the question we need to be asking. Maybe the role of the church should be to nurture and support mystical experience rather than controlling it." The theologian, Reynolds, had been quietly studying the statue throughout their discussion. From a doctrinal standpoint, there's actually strong precedent for what we're witnessing. The gifts of the Spirit described in 1 Corinthians, the mystical traditions within Christianity, the emphasis on personal relationship with the divine, all of these support the possibility that Mrs. Whitfield's experiences are authentically Christian rather than heretical. Bishop Harrison nodded slowly. "The problem isn't with Mrs. Whitfield's experience, it's with our institutional fear of anything we can't control or predict." Grace had been listening to the theological and administrative discussion with growing impatience. Finally, she stood up and addressed the room directly. "With all due respect to your processes and procedures, you're missing the point. This isn't about church doctrine or institutional authority. This is about people who are suffering, people who are searching for meaning, people who need to know that they're not alone in the universe." She gestured toward the still glowing statue. "This statue has been in my family for 5 generations. For 5 generations, women have brought their fears and hopes and desperate prayers to it. And now, finally, it's responding, not with answers that can be written in textbooks, but with presence, with love, with the assurance that the spiritual world is real and immediate and accessible." The room fell quiet as everyone absorbed her words. "The question you should be asking," Grace continued, "isn't how to contain this or control it or make it fit into your existing structures. The question is how to serve it, how to help it reach the people who need it most." Thomas stood beside her. Grace is right. Instead of trying to determine whether her experiences fit our theological categories, we should be asking how we can support her ministry and create space for others who might have similar gifts. Bishop Harrison walked to the window and stared out at the grey October sky. When he turned back to face the room, his expression had changed completely. Mrs. Whitfield, Pastor Brennan, I want to propose something unprecedented. Instead of trying to suppress or control what's happening here, I want to embrace it. I want to create a new kind of ministry within our diocese, one that specifically welcomes and nurtures mystical experience. Grace and Thomas exchanged amazed glances. The bishop continued, Pastor Brennan, you'll retain your position at St. Matthew's, but with an expanded role. You'll also serve as Director of Spiritual Formation for individuals with extraordinary gifts. Mrs. Whitfield, I'd like to offer you a formal position as a lay minister with full diocesan support for your counseling work. Dr. Morgan leaned forward. I'd like to be involved as well. This could be an opportunity to bridge the gap between psychological and spiritual understanding of mystical experience. The statue's light pulsed brighter for a moment, as if approving of the direction the conversation had taken. Grace felt overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of everything she'd expected. She'd come prepared to defend herself and Thomas against institutional rejection. Instead, she was being offered official recognition and support. There's one condition, she said carefully. This can't be about the church claiming ownership of something it tried to suppress for over a century. The spiritual gifts in my family and in others who might come forward don't belong to any institution. They belong to the people who have them and to the communities they serve. Bishop Harrison nodded. Agreed. The church's role should be to support and facilitate, not to control or direct. Thomas felt his wooden cross growing warm against his chest, not with supernatural heat this time, but with a deep sense of rightness about the direction they were heading. When do we start? He asked. Immediately, the bishop replied. Mrs. Whitfield, would you be willing to return to St. Matthew's this Sunday and share your story again, this time with my full support and blessing? Grace looked at the statue, which had resumed its gentle, steady glow. She thought about her great-great-grandmother Bridget, about all the women whose voices had been silenced, about all the people in the community who were struggling with questions of faith and meaning. Yes, she said, I'll share my story as many times as it takes for people to understand that the spiritual world is real, immediate, and available to anyone who's open to experiencing it. The meeting ended with plans for Sunday's service and discussions of how to support others who might come forward with their own mystical experiences. As they prepared to leave, Bishop Harrison approached Grace privately. Mrs. Whitfield, I want you to know that what happened here today has changed me profoundly. I've spent my entire career managing the institutional aspects of faith. Today, for the first time in decades, I experienced the divine directly. Grace smiled. That's what this is all about, Bishop. Not managing faith, but living it. 6 months later, Grace stood in the garden behind St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, watching as visitors from 3 states gathered around the small shrine she had built to house her grandmother's Virgin Mary statue. The shrine was simple, a wooden platform surrounded by flowering plants and comfortable benches, but it had become a pilgrimage destination for people seeking spiritual healing and guidance. The transformation had been remarkable. What began as Grace's personal crisis of faith had evolved into a movement that was changing how people understood the relationship between institutional religion and mystical experience. The statue, now permanently housed in its outdoor sanctuary, glowed gently each evening at sunset, visible to anyone who came seeking comfort or answers. Grace's role as a lay minister had expanded beyond anything she'd imagined. People traveled from across the region to meet with her, sharing their own stories of supernatural encounters, seeking guidance for developing their spiritual gifts, or simply wanting to experience the presence they'd heard about from others. Thomas had adapted beautifully to his dual role as parish pastor and director of spiritual formation. Sunday services at St. Matthew's had become unlike anything in the Episcopal tradition, a blend of liturgical worship and space for spontaneous spiritual expression. The stained glass window behind the altar, now completely healed from its century-old damage, seemed to capture and reflect light in ways that enhanced the sense of sacred presence. The most surprising development had been the number of people who came forward with their own accounts of mystical experience. Dr. Morgan's research had been correct. There were many individuals in the community who had encountered the supernatural, but had kept quiet about it for fear of rejection or ridicule. Grace's public testimony had given them permission to speak about dreams that came true, healings that defied medical explanation, and moments of knowing things they couldn't possibly know through ordinary means. Mrs. Patterson had become one of Grace's most enthusiastic supporters, helping to organize the weekly support groups for people developing their spiritual gifts. "I always knew there was more to this world than what we could see," she told anyone who would listen. Grace just gave the rest of us courage to admit it. The church hierarchy's response had been mixed. Some dioceses were watching the Millbrook experiment with interest, while others were concerned about setting precedents that might lead to theological chaos. But Bishop Harrison had remained steadfast in his support, even as he faced criticism from more conservative colleagues. "What we're doing here isn't revolutionary," he'd said in a recent interview. "We're simply returning to the understanding that spiritual experience is meant to be lived, not just studied. The early Christian communities would recognize what we're experiencing." On this particular evening, Grace was preparing for the weekly healing service that had grown out of requests from people who came to visit the shrine. What had started as informal conversations had evolved into structured gatherings where people could share their experiences, receive prayer and guidance, and support others on their spiritual journeys. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Grace felt the familiar warmth that indicated the statue was beginning its evening glow. She watched as 23 people gathered on the benches, including several who had driven hours to be present. Among them was a young mother whose child had been healed of a chronic illness after visiting the shrine, an elderly man who claimed the statue had helped him communicate with his deceased wife, and a teenager who had discovered she could see visions of lost objects, a gift that had made her invaluable to the local police department. Thomas joined Grace as the group prepared for their time of prayer and sharing. "Any regrets?" he asked, a question he'd posed regularly over the past 6 months. Grace looked around the garden at the faces of people who had found hope and healing through experiences they'd never imagined possible. "None," she said. "This is what I was meant to do. This is what my whole life was preparing me for." The statue's glow intensified as darkness fell, bathing the entire gathering in soft, warm light. Grace began the service as she always did, by telling her story, how anger and disbelief had led her to try to destroy the very thing that would ultimately save her faith. But tonight, as she spoke about her great-great-grandmother Bridget and the generations of suppressed spiritual gifts, she felt a presence she'd never experienced before. Standing beside her in the garden, invisible to the others but clear to Grace, was Bridget herself, not as a vision or memory, but as a living presence bridging the gap between worlds. "Thank you," Bridget whispered, her Irish accent soft and musical. "You've given voice to all of us who were silenced. You've restored what was taken." Grace felt tears of joy streaming down her face as the service continued around her. The statue's light reached its peak brilliance, and every person in the garden could feel the warmth of divine presence settling over them like a blessing. A young girl, maybe 7 years old, approached the shrine with her grandmother. As they knelt together before the glowing statue, Grace heard the child whisper a prayer of thanksgiving for her grandfather's recovery from surgery. The grandmother's eyes filled with tears as she recognized in her granddaughter the same spiritual sensitivity that ran in their family line, gifts that would no longer need to be hidden or suppressed. As the service concluded and people began to drift away, many stopping to speak privately with Grace about their own experiences, Thomas stayed behind to help close the garden for the evening. "What do you think happens next?" he asked as they secured the shrine for the night. Grace looked at the statue, which had settled into its gentle evening glow. "I think we keep doing what we're doing. We keep creating space for people to experience the divine directly. We keep supporting those whose gifts don't fit into conventional categories. And we trust that the love we've experienced here will continue to spread to wherever it's needed." She paused, thinking of all the people who had found healing and hope in this simple garden, of all the spiritual gifts that were being awakened and nurtured instead of suppressed. "Most of all," she continued, "we remember that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about staying open to mystery, to love, to the possibility that the spiritual world is more immediate and accessible than we ever dared to believe." As they walked back toward the church building, the statue continued to glow behind them, a beacon of hope for anyone seeking to bridge the gap between the earthly and the divine. The story that had begun with Grace's attempt to destroy her faith had become a testament to the truth that sometimes burning away what we think we know is the only way to discover what we truly need. In the months and years that followed, the Millbrook ministry would continue to grow, drawing people from around the world who sought authentic spiritual experience beyond the boundaries of conventional religion. And at the heart of it all would remain the simple truth that Grace had learned in her darkest moment, that love persists beyond doubt, that presence transcends absence, and that sometimes the most profound faith emerges not from certainty, but from the courage to remain open to wonder.